o'clock Eastern time. And welcome everyone to a rather impromptu thrown together this week webinar. And I'm so grateful for all of our panelists for joining us for this. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to our BNG website by this evening, probably. Our conversation is about the Southern Baptist Convention. And some of you who follow some of us on Facebook may have seen the little back and forth we've had about the title of this seminar. I quickly called it Exiles from the SBC, and Bill rightly pointed out that he's not an exile, he left on his own. And I think we have an interesting conversation about the word exile. I thought later I should have called it runaways from the SBC, because I think that may more accurately describe where we are. And also, in case you're not noticing a trend here, I'm going to speak for myself. We're all mature in years, and that's on purpose. We wanted this to be a group of folks who've sort of been through the battles and have some perspective to share, because this is one of those cases where what goes around comes around. And we've all got stories to tell about this that are going to be important, I think, for understanding what's going to happen in Nashville this week. So I've got a set of questions we're going to discuss. And I've said to our five panelists that we're all, myself included, strong personalities, and we're going to try to make sure we share the mic along the way. I've enabled the Q&A function. If you would like to ask a question for us to answer, or one of us or any of us to answer, just type it in along the way. It may take me a little while to get to those, but I'll keep those queued up. So feel free, those of you who are joining us. And we have more than 100 people online right now already for this conversation. We're so delighted that you're here and that you're following. As you know, this story just keeps developing. Yesterday, there was a new wrinkle in that the SBC Executive Committee is going to investigate itself and report the findings to itself. And just when you think it can't get any weirder, sure enough, it does. So deep breath. Let's start with this question. So I'd like our panelists to discuss what are some of the broad implications of the current SBC drama that we're seeing playing out, and how does that intersect racial justice, white male authoritarianism, misogyny, white Christian nationalism, and the future of democracy in the United States?
And we close at midnight tonight, right?
pick one. Just give us some opening thoughts, okay?
Well, I think, Mark, that's a good introduction, because this is bigger than simply the SBC. We're really talking about the heresy of hateful faith, which is a global phenomenon, whether you're talking about Modi in India, or whether you're talking about the hateful faith of the Taliban, or you're talking about the hateful faith of the SBC, or hateful faith someplace else. We're really talking about hateful faith. And so I hope that we won't see this as something peculiar to the Southern Baptist Convention, as tempting as that might be. Because quite frankly, I don't think the rest of the world is nearly as interested in the Southern Baptist Convention as they are in themselves.
Wendell, I think it's a great point, and I've said multiple times that the SBC is a microcosm of national politics in America. And I think, you know, you're right, it's even beyond that. This is it's illustrative of the movement. Yeah. One of our other panelists?
Well, I want to add, thread back in this question of exile, because I've been doing some thinking on that, Mark, and I know Bill's got a take on it, but let me add one more piece to this in terms of exile is a good thing, heavily influenced by Walter Brueggemann and his understanding of exile, particularly from Jeremiah, Lamentations, the idea that it is from a place where you can see with clarity. It is a place where either voluntarily you've chosen it or you have involuntarily chosen it, but it gives you vision. And so I want to kind of turn that around and say, this is a place of clarity without being so intricately woven into the system. We can perhaps see it and be able, as Wendell's saying, to think about it as hateful faith. So I would like to take that positive tack and say, looking at this moment in time is also like looking at individual moments in time. Let me briefly say it's 1963 and I am age 10. And my father is a Southern Baptist pastor. We've gone to all the conventions. They've been our family vacations, and we just go and we meet and greet all the Baptist pompadours that are in there with that slick hair and those slick suits. And we're all excited to be there, but it's 1963. And there is when we come home, there is a discussion in the back of the church with the deacons, and they're whispering, they're agitated, they're saying, there may be a Black person that's coming to church on Sunday. This is in South Carolina Baptist. What are we going to do about it? Flip then to another decade, now 74, I'm age 21, and there's another set of deacons, they're in North Carolina, and they are saying we cannot sign this recommendation form for Linda to go to seminary because it says it will prepare her for the gospel ministry. Scratch that out. And so this Baptist document, or this document that's going to a Baptist seminary from a Baptist church, has to say she can go study if she's prepared to work with children. Oh, things have not changed. That was 63, 74. So yeah, I like what you said, been there, done that. So there's a point that we are seeing this again and again and again.
I think one thing that resonated with me about that question, Mark, about our place, our interest in what is actually happening in the SBC is really also indicative of its history. Or this is our Baptist family, and these roots are a part of our heritage. And I think back to the 1840s, to continue Linda's theme, and the commitment to defend slavery, the racist attitudes that were embedded in that energy in the 1840s were more than a result of something. And that's what I want to say about the moment today. It's more than the result of something, it's a precursor to something. The 1840s was a precursor to what would happen in the nation in terms of division and what would come, and the absolute commitment to defend slavery. That was given legs by the institution of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so the meaning, the understanding of the intersection of racism, misogyny, hatefulness towards other Christians, I mean, all the kinds of things of bickering, all these things are precursors. We're learning what can be accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
I think Suzi's point's extremely well taken, and I'll want to hear Wendell on these issues, but the historian in me says that the Southern Baptist Convention began in 1845 with a biblical hermeneutic, that is a method of interpreting the Bible, that was grounded in in giving biblical support to chattel slavery. That hermeneutic was one of the major reasons why Richard Furman, 1822, had the holding of slaves been a moral evil, we cannot suppose that the holy apostles who feared not the faces of men would have tolerated it for a moment in the Christian church. That argument has gotten carried into the 21st century, and the inerrantist hermeneutic is one of the reasons that the Southern Baptist Convention has never been comfortable with Black people, because if it gives up that literalistic hermeneutic, on slavery to the fullest, it will have to give up other interpretations of that, particularly going back to Linda's illustration, the doctrine of complementarity and the idea of submission, because slavery and that complementary doctrine are both used in those same parallel texts that went back to slavery. And as long as that hermeneutic becomes the normative, then the Southern Baptist Convention is going to be trapped in 2021, but by 1845. And so the pietistic voice of we're all one in Christ welcomes Black people, but when they get there and say, but since we're here, there are these issues, and then the convention consistently across its history, from Jim Crow on, as Linda illustrated, pushes back. We want you, but we can't take you fully because of the way we read the Bible.
And it's been in service to political parties and partisans from the beginning too. Like Robbie Jones points out in White Too Long, Basil Manley Sr., founder of a seminary some of us went to, was in service to Jefferson Davis. And now we see a similar thing continuing, really an almost unbroken succession, I would imagine you could say. But that also then stands on its head what has been, I think, a Southern Baptist claim, that it is pushing culture and it is leading culture, and culture is bad, dualistic, and yet it's just being dragged along by culture. And most of the time you can't look at them and see the difference of it. It's kind of like, you know, communities that grow together. If you're not from there, you don't even know when you leave one and go into the other. And I think that's the same thing that's happened now.
Wendell, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I really think that we're talking about the intersection of race, class, power, religion, gender, and the whole notion of the, as Bill mentioned, the way of reading scripture and reading otherness into people.
Yes.
And so we're talking about whether we're talking about gender orientation and the way we treat people who are LGBTQI, or whether we treat, how we treat women, or whether we treat people who are not Christian, the way of othering people, as opposed to talking about the inclusive faith of God. And what we're really dealing with right now also is young people are saying, we don't care about this anymore. We're leaving, we're done with you. I mean, they are so done with conventions and churches and denominations that, quite frankly, the people who are Gen Xers and millennials could not care less about the Southern Baptist Convention or any other conventions. They do care about faith. They do care about justice. They do care about truth, but they don't want to do anything with church, and with good reason. They basically said, a pox on you. So we're all of a certain generation. I'm not a Southern Baptist exile. I'm a Southern Baptist critic. My distance is intentional, but quite frankly, the younger people are saying, what I'm concerned about is hateful faith. And the young people are saying the hatefulness of faith, however you package it, is something I will have nothing to do with.
I still think about this place of critique or of clarity of vision, whatever we might say, that is our gift of being able to look on the outside of that particular system. At least gives me greater understanding, for having been on the inside of it, as many of us were. There is a tendency to belong without even questions. It's a great social space. It's a great place to know and be known. It's a common, as we said in the mountains, a common quarterly. I learned later when I got to be an old, it's called quarterly. So I correct my own language there. But we had a common text. Cooperative Baptist Program. What a genius way of fundraising. All those things brought us together. And it became a place where it was hard to critique Wendell on the inside of it. But having now seen that I cannot function on that inside, some of us voluntary exiles, some of us involuntary exiles, some of us just choosing to no longer live in Jerusalem at all, then we're able to see that as others have understood, things that are good becomes concretized. Right? And that metaphor, however good it might have been and however solid it might have given us an opportunity to grow in faith, once it becomes worshiped and the container becomes more important than that which is contained, then we are in trouble and a revolution is needed and reformation is required. When that metaphor becomes so concretized, it does not speak anymore to anyone. And I kind of feel like that's where we are in so many ways there now.
Well, these are all brilliant comments and so true that, and I think this is a good hinge to come to another thing that just occurred to me today that you're talking about, and that is, you know, for those of us who were in the SBC and left the SBC, we represent what was a middle to left wing of the SBC, I guess. And once we're all gone, the center of gravity shifted even further to the right in that. And I'm wondering, you know, from how that affects what we're seeing today, because it looks to me like we have the ultra conservatives fighting the ultra conservatives within the SBC. I mean, this is all happening over here on this very narrow band of the spectrum. I mean, when someone's calling Russell Moore a liberal, you know, my antennas are like, he's no liberal, right? Not in any world I know. So would y'all maybe talk about where this drama is playing out on the large spectrum of American religion?
Could I offer a suggestion?
Sure.
Think about 1963 and a certain letter from Birmingham City Jail. Does it make any difference whether you write SBC or any other XYZ group of white Christians who call themselves evangelicals? Could not Martin King have made the same statement? And it didn't make any difference whether you consider yourself on the left side or the middle side or the right side. King's letter to Birmingham jail with his disappointment about what he called white moderates really was talking about the same hateful faith that we're talking about now. And he was talking about that in the intersection of politics in 1963, social justice. It was racial justice then. But now the issues are much more clear. It's racial justice, it's gender justice, it's economic justice, it's environmental justice, it's justice writ large. And what we're finding is, as we've mentioned, that this small way of thinking of faith, which is also hateful, is being seen by the wider community as cancerous. It is seen as cancerous. And the question is, will the people who have seen it call it heresy, or will we basically say, what a shame? Because quite frankly, if it's heresy, we need to call it heresy and say, it doesn't make any difference who's in charge of it. Quite frankly, if you're on the Titanic, who is the captain doesn't matter.
I want to echo that, and you're going to have to forgive me. I knew our time would be limited, and this was a very important point to me, and it gets at this issue of belief. So I wrote a few sentences, and I'm just going to read them here to be sure that I'm clear. I didn't want to ramble on it. The SBC squandered the heartwarming conversion experience of Baptists by substituting pray a prayer, sign a confession of faith, and that's the transaction. They made religious experience a transaction. They've lost the centerpiece to their tradition in personal religious experience. Biblical inerrancy and confessionalism have overpowered hearts strangely worn into what old evangelists called corpse-cold creedalism of intellectualized orthodoxy. Their baptisms are declining in part because of demographics and in part due to a confusion as to the nature of conversion and absolute loyalty to a set of rigid dogmas. Wendell was getting at this. Once you enter fundamentalist rationalism, you're always in danger of not being fundamentalist enough. And Mark, that's what's happening with this group. They are going to probably have some sort of fissure or fragmentation, my word, since 1990. But now the denomination is so limited, so broken, so weak compared to what it was even in 90, that there's just not that much to break apart. But the underlying issue is, how many things do you have to sign to be a Southern Baptist?
It was called 6-point record system, right? So you had to do that. It was a way to grow this million more in 54. So it had a strategic plan to it. It grew us all to think the same, be the same, stay for preaching, bring your Bible to church, and witness to somebody during the week. And it seemed like that might have worked on some level, but it did not. And that dogma is biting us even now. So I just echo what you said. It was stated, but I thought of that Sunday school piece of paper that we had to sign every Sunday school to state our position and our action in this particular group that we belong, the Southern Baptist Convention.
I would just add to your point, especially for what Bill said, Southeastern Seminary now has 4 statements of faith that you have to affirm. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4. 4 different statements of faith you have to affirm in order to teach there, or I guess to be a student as well.
So this becomes moralism. This is the ism, is
Yes.
moralism that then becomes the system. And it's about sin management. The purpose of the denomination is
Yes.
sin management. We got to control this thing. We got to make sure we don't have it. And then if we find it, well, we have to create all the, I mean, I'll look at the question of addressing sexual abuse. These are complex, difficult issues for any type of organization. And if you are so boxed in every area, just to find redemptive work in an issue that is so devastating and so eviscerating of the church, you don't have any room to move. You don't have any room to heal. And that, so back to Wendell, to this ugly morality, this moralism that then becomes the box smaller and smaller, and who can. And so now we have 4 candidates, each trying to help recast that frame of orthodoxy to manage the sin.
Well,
Mark, could I push back on something?
Sure.
I challenge the proposition, and I think Linda meant it honestly, but I challenge the question that it worked. For whom? It worked if you were a white male.
Yeah.
Okay, if you were a white male Southern Baptist, that worked. But if you were a white woman, it didn't work. It certainly didn't work if you were a person of color.
Yeah.
It didn't work if you were LGBTQAI. It didn't work if you were an immigrant. It didn't work if you were not a Baptist. It didn't work if you were poor. It didn't work if you weren't Southern. It didn't work because it was not godly. It was really let me just say it. It was a culture of dogma as opposed to a following of the gospel. And so the gospel of Jesus, the heart of God, was not really affirmed. People talked about it, and hey, I've got a Southern Baptist man's name on my ordination certificate. I will go to my grave thankful for Dr. Robert Ferguson. On the other hand, Robert Ferguson was as far removed from some of the Southern Baptists, most of the Southern Baptists that I knew, as I am from Pluto. Okay, I mean the planet, okay, the X-planet. The X-planet, because he was not racist. He was not sexist. He was not small-minded. He was loving. And he was finding himself, even in the mid-1980s when I was ordained, like, he was finding himself wondering, as a white man who was born in the South, this isn't of God.
Mhm. Mhm.
This isn't working really.
No, I
And so I
take your
guess
challenge.
I question, are we
Mhm.
following Jesus? Was the Southern
Mhm.
Baptist Convention following Jesus? Then, if it wasn't then, and we know it wasn't following Jesus when it organized in 1845.
Mhm.
Okay.
I take your challenge, Wendell. And what I'm thinking about is that those prescribed rituals, that prescriptions there were, and rituals there were, from cradle roll to adult. I'm thinking of the girls' auxiliary and that memorization and the stages of going from this to that, and the common reading. All those things were ours. And there was a common hymnal, 1955, which was so different, the Brahman, than the 75. And it seemed to be opening up a little window. But it took being in exile, I must be honest and say, to see how deadly what seemed to be so easy to follow and prescriptive life, really, as I became of age, was a deadly proposition. Because you were right, you could be a girl in that denomination until you became a woman. And when you became a woman, you could not do what you did as a little girl. You played the piano for Vacation Bible School, but as that pastor told me, don't you touch God's sacred desk, because you are a woman. And don't you know, the 1984 says the Baptist Faith and Message, you brought evil into the world, and you cannot lead anyone because you're the epitome of evil. No, but it took being in exile to really see all that, Wendell, because I was so circumscribed by the rituals, by the prescription. So I hear what you're saying and agree.
It's a wonderful conversation and so true. My own experience is growing up in central Oklahoma, Southern Baptist from birth, and only knowing the world you know. Wendell, I lived in such a white suburb of Oklahoma City through my formative years that, honest to God, I did not know a single Black person. I did not know a single Jewish person. I knew one Catholic. I had one friend who was a Catholic, and we were pretty well convinced that the Methodists down the street were going straight to hell. That's the context of Southern Baptist I grew up in, but I didn't know any different until I was able to go away from there and have other experiences, and some other people really, helped open my worldview. And so I think your point, all of you, is really good, that it takes perspective and someone pulling back the curtain to say, wait, there's a bigger world out there than you ever knew. I was so Southern Baptist when in college in Albuquerque, the singles class I was in, we had a teacher who wanted to leave the Sunday school board curriculum, and you start using something from Navigators or something like that. And I threatened to leave the class permanently if they didn't use the right literature. That was 22-year-old Mark. And look where I am today. But we've all come from this kind of indoctrination. And I think that leads us to say, how much has the SBC and its culture been shaped by its founding story? and Bill alluded to this, some of you have alluded to this, it took 150 years for the SBC to acknowledge it was formed out of racism, right? And that even that didn't take, even, you know, we could talk about that, but how much of that origin story that we've believed has continued to shape, and by we, I mean collectively, right? Has continued to shape not only the SBC, but, you know, religious movements like it. What do y'all think about
Well, if you have to live with yourself and own another human being, then back to Suzi's point of sin management, Bill's point of hermeneutics, you have to define sin very narrowly. And I think that has implications, you know, 180 years later, because if you can define sin down to basically things you do, drinking, dancing, fornicating, adulterating, I mean, that's pretty much the narrow range of it. Then it's no surprise there's no emphasis on justice. There's no emphasis on how we treat other human beings. And so then it plays out in race, and it plays out in gender, and it plays out in women and men, and in just about every other way, because those get back to justice issues. And so that was, in my view, was pretty much defined out in the basics. We could find examples from some places where others articulated a broader hermeneutic and a broader ethic. But for the most part, when it was narrowly defined to those things, then how you behave toward other people was fine. And frankly, that's not just Southern Baptist, that was Southern religion that did that. And you can find that in practically any religion in the South, because if you owned slaves, then you had to define your sin so that it didn't prick your conscience at all. But it never left. It's coded into the DNA. And so now it seems that it all fits together, how women are treated, how abuse victims are treated, how LGBTQ persons are treated, how all persons of color are treated.
I think it's interesting too that Russell Moore's new job at Christianity Today is a public theology project. That's not lost on me. That there is not that even room for public theology right now with such strict regimen of orthodoxy, and that I think there is such a hunger and thirst for ethics and justice and social justice, and it has to break out of these forms. And I think his exodus there is good news for public theology, for a more generous orthodoxy, for a more full discussion of just Christian issues that need to be discussed. And I applaud that and know how frightening it is to leave home in that manner. And, so that's true for lots of folks. But I think Russell represents that energy.
I'm not seeing the energy. I keep thinking about a guy named Clarence Jordan. Hello, who was Southern and white, and he wasn't a racist, and he was on Martin Luther King's staff at the SCLC. And the Southern Baptist Convention rejected him.
Yes, he was on the outside looking in.
He was on the outside. Before there was the first split in the 90s, before there was a so-called inerrancy movement, Clarence Jordan said, y'all would rather be friends with Jesus than followers of Jesus. He was talking about to white Baptists. And so this kind of hateful faith is not generational. This is not episodic. It is who the people are. And let's just call it what it is. It is wicked. Okay? It is wicked, whether it's in 2021 or 1845. It was wicked in 1845. It was wicked in 1963. It's wicked in 2021. And quite frankly, the chickens have come home to roost. The problem we now have is it has metastasized to our politics. And so our whole democracy is threatened by this hateful faithfulness. Lewis Brogdon's recent article that you mentioned in Baptist News Global, Mark, about hateful faith is spot on. This is the problem of our time, hateful religion. And the Southern Baptist Convention is, quite frankly, Exhibit A, but it is not the only exhibit.
Well, to your point, Wendell, I don't think this is a phrase, a label I've coined, but it's one I like to use. It's Theo Bros. You know who I'm talking about with the Theo Bros? So when I think of the Theo Bros, I think of these young Calvinist white male pastors who are angry. Not all young Calvinist pastors are angry, but there's a subset that are really, really angry, and they're active on Twitter as the defenders. I mean, they're the John MacArthur kind of people, the Al Mohler kind of people who are out checking everyone on Twitter and are really, really mean about all this stuff. And I think one of the surprising things to some people is to realize there is a younger generation that has been indoctrinated in some of this hate that's contrary to their peers in that millennial and younger generation. But they find a ready home in not just the SBC, but in some of these John MacArthur-like circles. And by the way, John MacArthur thinks Rick Warren's a liberal. So,
Calvinism.
Can we also admit that what we're seeing is resentment, white male resentment, because women not only got into seminary, they started making the best grades to include the best grades in theology and preaching. Okay, and you can't have white Baptist preachers get beat in the classroom on theology and preaching without some white resentment. I've been around white men long enough to see, hey,
and I think that's
long enough, you get some kickback. And what we're seeing is the kickback, the misogyny, the Beth Moore situation. Beth Moore outsells some of the preachers. Hello? And Beth Moore's no flaming liberal.
Wendell, when you speak about the effect outside the SBC and you talk about those categories, I hear the word authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And that's what's shaping this culture dramatically. And it is grounded in much of the public popular profession in white males. And I think that's a very important point to make, that again, and I go back to fundamentalism. Fundamentalism was grounded in authoritarianism, particularly in the, quote, under shepherd, who was on the great chain of being, the great order of creation. Women were in that, in a kind of dotted line through their husband. And that phrase, the order of creation, comes up again and again with many of the leaders of the SBC, many of whom also speak out of a reformed, a sort of reformed theology. And in their view. But I think I keep coming back to, and Mark picked up here, all of you have, once the 13th Amendment was in place, and once the war was lost, Southern Baptists could no longer continue to take their Bibles and make slavery biblically normative. So what did they do? They turned to the lost cause, to segregation, to Jim Crow. You have Thomas Dixon, Wake Forest graduate, writing The Klansman and the Leopard Spots. Klansman becomes the basis for The Birth of the Nation, silent movie, one of the most racist movies made in this country ever. And you mentioned Clarence Jordan. You have Will Campbell writing about the stem of Jesse, where many of the Baptist colleges were integrated not by African Americans, but by Africans who had been converted on the mission field. And the one argument the Southern Baptists couldn't make is, we can't win them to Christ and tell them they can't come to our schools. But you have Will's story about Sam Oney, whom I've had the honor to meet, who was the African student who came to Mercer University, and they wouldn't let him enter the Tatnall Square Baptist Church. And Will documents that in the Stem of Jesse, and that's an African. And had it not been, and there they used the evangelism mission card to integrate a school when the people who lived across the street couldn't get in. But again, to come back again and again to how that hermeneutic on race was remade again and again, and then how pieces, particularly, there's a point at which the Southern Baptist Convention as a denomination repudiated fundamentalism with J. Frank Norris and others. But then it makes a comeback, and now it's in control. And that is the moralism, Suzii. Apparently, immorality, sexual immorality is inappropriate except for ministers who commit sexual abuse, and their churches then cover it up. So I'm wondering, Wendell, I've thought for years, Southern Baptists, if they wanted to redeem themselves, should have said in 1863, we're not going to speak, no, let's say 65, let's give them the end of the war. We're not going to talk about race until we exorcise racism from our denomination. We're not going to moralize, Suzii, on race. Now I think Southern Baptists need to say, given the expose of sexual abuse, we're going to say as a denomination that we will not moralize about sex for 25 years in order to publicly repent. I know that's a silly thing to say on one level. On another, for me, it makes the point. You can't go around telling people what they need to do about sexuality or race when the organization that is making those pronouncements has lived a life direct or permitted a lifestyle that was directly opposed to them.
I want to jump in on that, Bill, and ask Suzii in particular, everyone else can weigh on this too, but I know Suzii has some particular experience in dealing with the larger issue of sexual abuse in the church, and you've been an advocate and so forth on that, and just have a lot of data, I know, in your head. And clearly that's one of the big presenting issues this year at the SBC annual meeting is this reckoning that's happening among otherwise very conservative people who are concerned about, and this is Russell Moore, right? And he thinks this is one of the big dividing issues that got him. What is your perspective on that? And how do you see that fitting into the bigger puzzle that you have already worked on?
A couple of things I'd say. Number one, denominations, and especially in our tradition, are such strange animals when it comes to power. Power is granted to them rather than asserted by them, really, and it becomes kind of a circle, a cycle. With having been in two different large denominational bodies in the executive committee as one of either the only woman or one of very few women at the top during times at both the BGCT and at CBF, when we deal with trying as a denomination to create the strategies, the muscle memory, the channels to address sexual abuse within the church. This is hard work, and there are no given patterns. There isn't something there that you just pick up and put a little WD-40 on and it works again. These are hard, crystallized issues that are, so I think of that in this case, the toolbox for the Southern Baptist Convention to deal with sexual abuse within its own denomination. What they know how to do is to defer to something more minimalist or something that they can tag with, well, it's that worldview or it's that theory or something like that, rather than deal with the actual processes that need to go deeply enough into congregations, into the appointment of missionaries and abuse on the mission field and abuse within staff areas. I mean, these are realities that take very difficult, I mean, commitment over time. You change the processes. You don't just add a committee here and there or a report here and there to make that happen. And that's true for racism. And so back to Bill's idea, you know, of, okay, let's take 20 years and figure out how to do this right. That's not a, I think for all denominations, for all religious bodies that are taking seriously the difficulties of abuse within, that it is a 20-year journey and it's multi-generational.
And it's not, it's not new either. It's not new either. I mean, I've been covering Baptists for a long, long time before I went to CBF. And from early days of my memory, leaders that were on the other side that got cast out were punting on doing anything about sexual abuse, particularly clergy sexual abuse, because of our polity of church autonomy. Oh, we can't do that. We can't police. And I mean, I could name names, and they're revered people that have mostly gone to be with Jesus now. And so it's systemic, but it also Baptist decentralization allows sin to float. It becomes somebody else's problem because we don't police it.
And
maybe
maybe
that have been said that are released on these tapes about victims of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
The offensiveness of the comments.
and the reality, I mean, we were taught, were we not, that somehow humility is a value. Somehow repentance is the goal of every church service. There is an altar call with 25 verses of just as I am, which is supposed to move you to that point of asking for forgiveness and I'll use our language, getting your heart right, and moving out into the world as a tender, humble individual. The recanting or the realization that this is a basic misogynist perspective that's built into the DNA of this institution, or it's a typical racist inside the DNA of the institution. How do you go in and find that? You know, Beth, bless her, Beth Moore needs to recant of her complementarian position that she took in order to survive within that denominational space for that long. Because that also did damage in terms of saying, yes, it's not fully free, you're still under the auspices of that. Basic misogyny pushes itself up in all kinds of manifestations. When would it be something, Wendell, you know, if we could say we are racist, we are sexist, and God help us to not be that anymore.
Well, but Linda, as my late father would often say, that would be too much like right. And here's the problem. I mean, we're all graduates of Bible study. I keep thinking about the misogyny. I keep thinking about that Old Testament character we don't talk about, Tamar.
Mm-hmm.
Tamar, who was raped by her half-brother, and who Nathan, the prophet, did not go to David, the king, and say, what are you going to do about the fact that your son, the crown prince, raped his half-sister? And we don't preach about that, but what is the consequence? What's the downstream consequence when you have a religion that talks about biblical inerrancy, has that in its Bible, and does not learn a lesson, and then forgets that you've also covered up all the rapes of slaves, all the rapes of that were done on the mission field, all the rapes, and only when white women are raped by white preachers in Baptist churches, now we're talking about this, but when Black women and indigenous people were being raped, We weren't talking about this. And excuse me, I am happy for us to talk about misogyny, but please, this conversation is happening way the heck too late for a lot of us.
Wendell, I have to add one caveat to what you just said and tell you that our pastor, Paul Robeson Ford, who writes for BNG, preached on the Tamar text last Sunday.
Bless him.
And thank God for him. Yes.
Well, on that point, at the anti-wokeness conference that happened here in Dallas this weekend, Tommy Nelson from Denton Bible Church apparently preached on that lovely death in the pot passage, sort of continuing an interesting tradition there. I just read that this afternoon. That's the bonus comment for the moment here. All right, I'm going to move us forward on time. This is fascinating. We're getting some good comments here, and those of you who are commenting and asking questions, trying to work through that. I had one person, Bill, say that we need to hear more from you than we're hearing, and another person said it looks like you're sitting in Paige Patterson's office.
Oh.
Oh, don't bite, Bill. Bill, do not bite.
Be strong.
Okay,
Bite. Take a pass, Bill.
All right. You're a good man to help me. Thank you.
Help me, Jesus. Yes.
I'll blush and then
Temptation.
Here's a question I'm personally interested in. So I'm just going to throw it out here. There are some moments when I want to feel sorry for Russell Moore, and there are other moments when I don't, because Russell has been Al Mohler's henchman and surrogate from long ago. And some of you know, I'm not going to name names here, that a lot of the opposition to CBF and the whole ruckus over LGBTQ was generated by Russell Moore. And now he's gotten a dose of his own medicine, it seems like. And I want to feel sorry for him some days because I think he's changed, but I'm not sure. What do y'all think?
It takes a long time, even living in exile, for any of us to get that clarity. I'd say he's not ready, not that I know him personally, nor can even make that position. But you still contain the DNA of that which you've come from until you get out there wandering around the streets of Babylon, eating a different cuisine and drinking different water, that you can come to clarity. So I think anyone that moves out and starts creating some type of new position, new dogma, new thought is to be under suspect. You just need more time.
I would take a counter position, I guess. I mean, I don't disagree with Linda's premise. And I remember when Russell came to early CBF meetings and basically did gotcha stories on books that were being sold in the library, in the bookstore, that maybe the author wasn't even present, and said something that was allegedly scandalous. I think it's taken an enormous amount of moral courage to take the stands that Russell has taken on race and on sexual abuse over the last several years. I know personally he's given a lot of hope and help to young pastors who have been distressed by the SBC's racism, misogyny. And I have some sympathy there because they're entitled to their theological positions. I think many of them are deeply held. Maybe if we could talk long enough, they'd see the light. But on the other hand, I think they're firmly held. And I know that he has been someone who has given some sense of guidance toward a sense of seeking some levels of dignity. We don't agree on women in ministry. We don't agree on women in the family. We don't agree on a lot of things. But he's staked out a courageous position on race and on sexual abuse. And at least for those, I give him enormous credit for courage, of his convictions. The tapes that play when we hear what's being talked about sound like they were the same tapes we were hearing in the late 70s and the 80s about the CLC under Floyd Valentine. And rather than cave, I mean, he's been one of the few that I can think of the leaders, and I don't know them all well anymore, that hasn't just capitulated, gone along to get along. And so can there be more? Yeah. And I hope from his platform, we see a lot more of leadership and continued growth. But I see a different person than what we first encountered when he was a graduate student in Southern Seminary years ago. So I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt on where he is now.
Bill, the people want to hear your views on this.
Russell is a case study that every fundamentalist, particularly white males, should know. No one is safe. You may think you're a doctrinal, card-carrying fundamentalist with all the right doctrines, but you cross one line and they will come for you. And the ecclesiastical landscape is littered with bodies of people who thought that there was a whole group of people who came to Southern Seminary as we were getting on the helicopters to get us off the roof of the embassy. And they thought they were smarter than all of us. God bless them, they probably were. And that they knew how to deal with fundamentalists. And I could run a list of those. And they went to some of the other seminaries. They lasted minimally because they couldn't sign everything. I'm sorry to keep riding this horse. Russell had to learn, number one, learn the hard way that once you get in a leadership position and once they have you, Mark, you talk about wokeness. Fundamentalists invented wokeness. Of finding the slightest doctrine that went wrong and then you're out. That's number one. Number two is when the bell sounds, when they finally come for you, it's helpful when the culture has changed in your favor. So Russell comes out of the Southern Baptist Convention and he's greeted as a hero. Why? Because the country, the right wing in the country, and because Russell and because the Southern Baptists are so extreme that he looks like he's one of us. And so Russell waited, Linda, knowingly or unknowingly, for a very opportune time to come out. When he was doing what he was doing, Marv, at the CBF, Christianity Today wouldn't have let him come and write an op-ed.
Right.
But now he's being vaunted as someone who's crossed over and has always been insightful. No, the religious culture changed because the culture he was in was so destructive. And I think that's one thing that's happening to a younger generation of Southern Baptist ministers that you're seeing right about this. And I want to come back to one more thing about Russell, and that is Russell had sense enough to see that the Southern Baptist as an institution, someone said about a paycheck for him, is increasingly not going to be able to pay, to fund, to support ministers and leaders the same way they once did. That the convention is so weak that pieces of it are coming apart. And that's not to say that every other church in the country is not weak, because it is, by and large, given the demographics of the time. But that's my comment about Russell. If you're a fundamentalist, keep your bags packed. Or, my old line, keep a working relationship with U-Haul, because they will come for you.
Someone else want to weigh in on that before we move on?
I would just like to reiterate again, Babylon ain't bad, folks. And meaning to be able to stay quiet, think, understand, figure out where you were conscripted by whatever system you were conscripted in, that you sold your soul to come out of that and really think and ask for forgiveness, and then create a new methodology or a new song, and not always thinking you got to go back to Jerusalem to sing the same old song again. That's got to be helpful for everyone. But my feeling, my understanding, my sensibility is it doesn't happen overnight. And you have to stay unhinged, unloosed in Babylon for a long time and critique that which you have come from in order to get clarity as to where you should go. It's not just opposite of whatever it was you saw. It's got to be something deeper and more meaningful and more appropriate for the future, not just the opposite of what was. And that's painful. That's really painful. And then none of us like to be there. None of us want to be in that in-between space. But that pregnant pause, as Hannah Arendt says, that threshold moment is sometimes the most fertile and the most powerful for the future, that uncomfortable space. And maybe that would be a good healing thing for him to be uncomfortable for a little while longer.
Okay, so
Mark,
yes.
I don't feel sorry for Russell. Okay, I don't feel sorry for Russell. Actually, I see Russell being a great example of white male privilege in the Baptist tradition.
Mhm.
Because, and it's very unbiblical, because in the biblical sense, what happens is after you have had a spirit of sin and you realize you've been in sin, you go to the wilderness for reflection. Russell's not going to the wilderness. He's being given another pulpit.
That's
He's
right.
being given a podium.
That's
He's
right.
being promoted, and he's going to be seen, to Linda's point, as an arbiter of some kind of virtue, by virtue of the fact that he left a morally bankrupt system after having pirated its heresy for a generation. Now he's going to come and sell himself off as the paragon of enlightenment. And only white males get that in our society, because white women don't get that. And people of color don't get that. And so I see this as just another white male deal. But to another point, I really think we need to ask ourselves this question. Does it really matter what Russell Moore does if the same hateful faith that Russell Moore did in the SBC is done in a hateful faith light version for Christianity today? Because LGBTQ people aren't going to recognize any difference. Women aren't going to recognize any difference. People of color aren't going to be recognized any different, because quite frankly, I didn't remember Russell Moore talking about the era of criticizing and demonizing critical race theory.
Right.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, well said, well said. And so I want to bring this into a question.
That's wonderful,
By
Wendell.
one of our folks on the webinar that ties in. This is going to tie in a couple of threads that have come up, and this is setting the SBC again in the context of American religion. The question is, how does this play out against what's happening in other denominations and the non-denoms as well? And I want to add a wrinkle to that. I used my adult Sunday school class time this morning to sort of talk about what's going on in the SBC and what people should be looking for this week as this plays out. And I had a couple of people talk to me after class to say some variation on this theme. You know, they said either I or someone I know or love is not where the SBC is, but they're sure not where CBF or the Alliance of Baptists is either. They're somewhere in between, in process on this, and they or I feel completely homeless in this. It just seems like, you know, we get painted here as you're in the SBC or you're over here. And there are a lot of folks I think are homeless in the middle and don't really have any place to attach to. And Marv and I have seen this play out in Texas. I've always, and Suzii, I've always said there's three kinds of Texas Baptists. there's SBC Texas Baptist, there's CBF Texas Baptist, and there's the people who say a pox on both your houses, I'm just a Texas Baptist, right? Sort of in trying to claim a middle. And how does all of that connect to what's going on with the SBC? Are we going to drive more people into homelessness?
A couple
What do you
of-
mean we, Kimasabi?
Yeah, not on they going to drive more people into homelessness.
And Mark, just one quick question. Is that so bad?
Amen.
That's my point.
Amen.
Is that such a bad place? Wilderness, exile, homelessness, trying to find the essence rather than the container. Is that, I asked it truly as a question, is that such a bad place?
And isn't that where prophets are born?
Hmm.
Prophets are never born in pietism. Prophets are born in wilderness experiences where they have to wrestle with their own unworthiness and their own flaws and the wickedness of systems that they are part of and empires they are wrestling with. And from that wrestling process, they emerge like steel from ore, refined. But until they go through that process, they are not ready to be useful in our tradition. And as I understand the tradition, now we can popcorn them out, microwave them out, but you know, if you want a kitchen knife, you don't have to have iron ore. You don't have to have a refinery.
I want to take us in a little bit of a different direction, and that is say, I agree very much with Wendell about the prophetic, but also in terms of history, there are times when history takes a turn and you have to make a decision because things are so bad and so terrible, and they're coming upon the society. And we're, in my view, we're at that point. So point one for me is I'm sympathetic with those people who are not one way or the other, but they don't have much time.
Mhm.
They're going to have to either stay there and hunker down and maybe be in the wilderness for a while, but the wilderness is getting overrun. And we're at a prophetic moment where you got to know where you stand. And Mark, when you described them, you know what I heard in that? I heard the Republican Party, which brings me to another whole point here. When you look at the Southern Baptist Convention, they are truly the Republican Party at prayer. When I read that statement by Borchardt, that one of the guys was one of those guys that was in that conference with them wanted to protect the base.
Mhm.
Protect the base.
Ronnie
Ronnie Floyd. Ronnie
That's
Floyd.
not a denominational word.
And they have modeled, and here we get into something that Linda and I talked about before we came, and that is this effort that what the Southern Baptist Convention is going through right now was a joint process between fundamentalists in the SBC and Republican operatives.
Mhm.
The base of the Republican Party that is evangelical began among Southern Baptists and Independent Baptists. This is James Guth's study on the new religious political right in the 80s. And so they're all this in this mess together. And when you're describing those people in the middle way, you know who I heard? George Will and Liz Cheney. They can't decide. They don't want to vote for Biden, but they couldn't vote for Trump. And they want to remake the party, but it's almost too late. And that's where we are right now. And you're asking about the larger picture. All of this has come into the whole culture. And that's why this is all a problem. But again, the case study is where is the nation headed? Look at the Southern Baptist Convention, what has happened. And the convention has so narrowed its base that it ain't got nowhere else to go. So they've got to cater to a group of people. And I want to add one more thing. And Wendell got the prophetic stuff going here with us. I am very, very tired of people saying, oh, the poor Republicans, they're being led astray. Oh, the poor Southern Baptists being led astray. After a time, if you don't know you're being led astray, you're not poor, you're either willful or ignorant. And not to know where this was headed, and now to see where it ended up, and still claim some sort of ignorance about it, or that's pathetic. That's not poor. That's pathetic, and that's happening in the political system, and it's happening in this denominational system, and that's how serious all this is. This is not just infighting with Southern Baptists. They are writ large in the Southern Baptist Convention. And I'll come back to this. The voting regulations that are now, or suppression, I call that in my Baptist News Global column. You all should all read it this week. That voter suppression, it is a part of that authoritarianism. It's a part of the control. It's the same kind of control that a kind of fundamentalism. You move everything so you control all the cards because your base is so small. If you don't control the system, you got nothing.
There is a political system. There is a word for this. It's called fascism. It is called fascism. That is the political system that is built on authoritarianism, that has always, in almost every modern era, been linked to religious nationalism. It was that way with the Nazis. It was that way with the Taliban. It's that way in India with Modi. We're seeing fascism writ large. And if you link white Christian nationalism and this notion of autonomy, authoritarianism, this belligerent militarism, we love our guns, we love our military, and we love our police, and this notion of resentment, you get fascism. And what happens when you get fascism in power with the cross of Christ is you have to have a crusade.
Oh my.
You have to have a crusade. History teaches us you will find people to demonize. You will make yourself martyrs, and you will declare yourself on a holy war.
So if the SBC is or was the litmus test for our national politic now, then we are sitting here on this panel as some of the experts and knowing what to do about it. I don't feel that confident of myself, but I know the rest of you are, meaning that we watched it happen. There were a few among us that said this is not going to go well. And many of us, including myself, said, oh, we can negotiate peace. We can give a little, they'll give a little, we'll all give a little, and we'll come out loving each other with a kumbaya moment around the campfire, and it'll all be okay. That's what some of us were saying. There was some of us, and Bill can call their names better than I can, who were saying, folks, this is going to be bad. So if we know how it ends, at least with this test, SBC test, that was seen to see if we could go for the jugular, and they did, and it happened, then what is the answer this moment? And I pose it as a question, for I don't have the answer. So I really do ask, we know how it ended in this petri dish called SBC and the takeover. What is it going to take for our national body to figure out a way forward for all of us to find whatever it is that God has given us to find?
You want the good news, or you want
I
the
want
easy to
both.
swallow? You want the truth, or you want the easy to swallow news?
Truth first, truth, because
Okay,
too much
first-
easy to swallow. No,
first
no
of
time
all,
for that.
I've been black too long to tell you the answer that white folks want to hear. The answer white folks want to hear is this is all going to work out. It is not going to work out.
No, sir.
Okay. This will end badly. What we are seeing with the SBC and the fascism that was the larger part of white religious nationalism means that we are headed more and more towards a situation where there is going to be, quite frankly, a battle for the soul, literally a existential battle for the soul of this nation. A house divided against itself cannot stand. You cannot have half of the population that is being, by women and people of color, disenfranchised politically. And then white men who are a declining part of the population being resentful and reserving through the Republican Party and white religious nationalism power to themselves and think that this is going to end well. Eventually, you're going to have people of color and women saying, we're not going to join the military. We're not going to fight your wars. We're not going to support your principles. And that will be a problem.
Okay, our time
We
is
need to hear.
narrowing. I'm going to try to bring us down to one other big focus that is related to this. I'm trying to tie together several questions people have had. A good friend of mine has commented recently about what he calls, statistically within the SBC, the browning of the SBC. And what he means by that is, if you look at the numbers, the SBC has been declining in membership for 14 years consecutively. The only real area of growth is among Hispanic congregations. And certainly we see that here in Texas and other places as well. And yet they're not represented in leadership either in this. And so depending on who gets elected president, what happens on critical race theory and all these other things that are at play this week, right? What is the likelihood of the black and brown pastors saying, we're just not doing this anymore, right? And if that happens, those numbers are just going to, it's going to accelerate the trend, I think. Is this realistic or what?
Well, some black pastors, I can't speak for the brown pastors, but some black pastors who have SBC connections are, to your point, Mark, really wrestling with whether or not they stay. I think of Dwight McKissick in Texas,
right,
who has been loyal to SBC, but Dwight is not going to be in Nashville. And Dwight has been wrestling openly. His notion of love and reconciliation makes him want to hope. But after what he's been through, and after seeing what happened with critical race theory, Dwight's been again thinking, hey, this is not workable. And so I think more pastors like Dwight, and to their credit, they're asking themselves, do I have to do this in order to be part of a denomination? No, there are other options. And so I think that's going to mean the SBC is going to lose. And that's going to be another factor, because baptisms are going down, revenue are going down, and all of a sudden the SBC looks like they are the white folks, want to be white folks Baptists. Or as I call them, they're the slaveholder Baptist Convention 2.0.
So I've been interested to know if in this convention, if they're going to deconstruct even the 2019 statement they had about critical race theory, is there going to be even a more assertive white supremacy type statement that's going to come out of the resolutions committee? That would not surprise me.
No.
Because to get votes, you might need to go there, right? So there's this divide is just right under the skin. The difference, and I, Linda, to your theme of exile is not the worst place to be, but how does that become a fertile place? How does that become a fertile place? This idea that certainty, okay, not, you think of the opposite of faith, often is said is doubt. No, I think the opposite of faith, logically speaking, is certainty, right? You just know everything and you're totally sure about it, but you can be totally sure about something and totally wrong.
Amen.
And I think that that whole idea of certainty being really, and you got to come up with all these, I think about the 17 layers in Dante's Inferno, so many different worldviews and different, sign this and do that. I mean, the scaffolding is complex to get there to certainty. But that, I don't see them deconstructing that. I see them adding to it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, well said.
Yes, I think so. And Suzii touched on something. I'd say it this way. Part of what slavery and the residual effects from 1845 to now indicates is you can be right about scripture and wrong about the gospel. And that's really what we're talking about here. They thought they were right about scripture and they built their whole argument. You can go back and see when the war was over, they could not believe that they'd been wrong about scripture. And they ended up, many of them, writing treatises in the whole lost cause thing, saying, it's because we didn't treat the slaves the way God intended us to and the way the apostle instructed us. It wasn't that slavery was wrong. So I think that's part of what we learned. I'm not sure there's time enough for the Browning to take effect because, and as Suzii said, I think it's going to get more fundamentalist. I'm going to keep using that word. It's going to get more fundamentalist, and that CRT is going to be more of a dividing point between who we are and who we are not. And that and doing that without even, number one, realizing in many cases what CRT says, and two, in not knowing how that kind of attack further divides the racial, creates the racial division. But underneath this, and we haven't said this yet, two quick things. One is the Southern Baptist Convention knows it can't survive without Black and brown members. And that's why they keep doing push-pull, because they're aging, their population is declining, and that's part of the whole thing about the seminaries. They can't keep 6 open if they don't reach out internationally or to students of color. But they keep doing things that run students of color off. That's one point. The other is, underneath all this is the loss of Protestant privilege in this country. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason the Southern Baptists, and I'll go back to Wendell, particularly white Protestant privilege. Black Protestant privilege didn't have much, Black Protestantism didn't have much privilege.
Right.
But that loss has meant that many have turned to the government to make up the difference that they used to have in the culture. And that's a part of this whole, why religious liberty has been redefined accordingly, because people that you remember when W.A. Criswell said it was the creation of infidels, separation of church and state. Now some of them act like they invented it. Roman Catholics are like that too, by the way, since we're talking. Yeah. But that loss of Protestant privilege is a major factor because the sociology of Sunday has changed to the point that it's not ever coming back the way it used to.
Okay.
Old church attendance.
We are close to out of time. I want to give each of our panelists about a minute to a minute and a half, 60 to 90 seconds, to make any closing revelations, thoughts, big ideas that we've not gotten across. We have a few unanswered questions here that we just didn't get to in this, and I welcome your thoughts. Whatever order y'all want to go in, let's hear some last thoughts from each person.
I'll go. So that in the 80s, in the Baptist feminist trajectory of Southern Seminary, and yes, there was one. So let me just hasten to say there was a Baptist feminism that was going on in terms of trying to be activists and advocates. So we tried to get all the women in our influence space to quit arranging the flowers for the communion table and to quit womaning the nursery and to quit teaching the children in the beginner class. Sit down, sisters, don't do anything. Sit down, sisters. We worked really hard to make that on a particular Sunday. We would all sit down just to see the lacunae, the holes that would be in the service. It did not work because there were several of our sisters in that large group of women that felt more comfortable doing the flower arrangements for the communion than serving communion. The point is, there's still some people who are comforted and lulled in that prescriptive notion of faith, and the container is still more valuable than what's in the container. I don't know how successful that would be, even to sit out Black and brown, or even to make that a possible activist kind of movement.
Next.
I think we need to remember. Go ahead, Suzii. Go ahead, Suzii.
I just want to speak as a denominational executive. That the vitality of any kind of organizing work has got to be to turn the denominational structure on its head, to serve the church and to serve the God experience and the God ordained, that the relationship with God through Christ of the individual and the vitality of the local congregation. Make that your business. Not certainty, not orthodoxy, but the vitality of these two things that are so central, and that the God experience abounds. It abounds when you nurse your baby. It abounds when you sit by a deathbed. But God experience abounds outside of these constructs that are ours, and any constructs we make. They are the things that should enable that God experience, and that relationship be strong because of them. Tear up your rule book, redo your governance, change your finance, enable your mission. That's the call.
Hear, hear.
William Augustus Jones was a Black pastor in Brooklyn, New York, who wrote a book, God in the Ghetto. And in God in the Ghetto, Bill Jones wrote that if you have flawed theology always produces dysfunctional psychology, which then turns into destructive and oppressive sociology. And, you know, all the isms that happen from that result from that dysfunctional theology. At some point, we're going to have to say that the theology of Southern Baptist life has been not just flawed, it was bankrupt. From 1845. And that what we're now dealing with is the fruit from that poisonous tree.
Yeah.
That tree has to be cut down and has to come up in a new kind of way. And the good thing is for it to be cut down. Because you really can't rehab. You can't rehab a rotten tree.
Hear, hear.
Next.
Well, I guess kind of following after that, this first SBC annual meeting I've been interested in a long, long time. wonder, looking at, been following Mark's written a lot of really good pieces about, what will happen, what's the difference. And my sense is the difference won't be decided on Tuesday or whatever day that they vote. But it's also caused me to think back. I've thought a lot about, Bill and I talked about this earlier. I mean, my own blind spots. I went through Southern Seminary. We didn't think of the origin stories all that much about Southern Seminary and the Southern Baptist Convention in that time. And I covered all those debates about leaders talking about our Baptist polity and church autonomy and why we couldn't do anything about clergy sexual abuse. And so, frankly, I'm chastened about my own blind spots and my own weaknesses and that sort of thing. And and it's kind of like Linda's comment about that the exile ain't all bad. Well, realizing your weak spots isn't all bad either. My prayer is that even those of us who may have a good dose of Schadenfreude this week about what's happening, and we were on the punished side of all of that in 1990, then maybe we'll learn something about how we are Christian and how we do church and community in ways that is more prophetic and healing, and maybe even remember some of our pain and grow from it.
You're here.
I've kind of made the points I wanted to tonight. I just agree with Marv and say I taught at Southern Seminary for 17 years. And I was part of a group of people who placed a great deal of emphasis on civil rights and worked with the African-American students who were there, and some of my closest friendships from those first group of African-American students that I taught there. But I did not pursue the slavery connection, and I must repent of that. So I can't shake my finger at the SBC and not at myself, and I should have done that. But the other thing to say is, and I think I'm echoing Wendell here, I guess two things. One, the SBC's dirty laundry is now in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, etc. And that's going to have major impact on all of us because of the B word. And because we live in the South, folks north of Baltimore think we're Southern Baptist because we're Baptists in the South, if we're white, particularly. That we need to take that seriously. And then we have to know this is a prophetic moment when we're not going to have choices very much longer in terms of Christian identity in the United States. And the SBC and its constituent connections are defining Christianity for the whole country right now. And that's one of the reasons the nons are, I'd say running like hell, but this is a broadcast.
I'm glad you didn't say that.
But they are. I didn't know if you could. But that's the challenge we have to face. And I think it's helpful that we talked about them, but now we have to talk, and Suzii picked up on this, I think, we have to talk about us and what we do with this moment in time and our own consciences.
The altar is now open, brothers and sisters. Turn to page 371 and we'll sing together. No, you're
Linda
right.
has her accordion ready.
I've
at
got
all
my
times.
accordion over here in the corner. 25 verses of Just As I Am might get us there, but maybe not.
I'm out. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it.
You don't have to. You can lead us.
I'll do 15 verses, but not 25.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting us. Thank you,
This has
Mark, for
been
inviting
fun.
us to talk
Thank
about
you,
for
Mark.
this. Great conversation. So many important things said here. I just want to conclude by bringing a bow around one very important thing. You cannot understand the Southern Baptist Convention if you do not understand national politics in the United States today.
Yes.
And you cannot understand United States politics if you do not understand the Southern Baptist Convention.
Thank you.
They are the
Yes,
same
yes.
thing in two
Yes.
different spheres. And we have seen it from the mid 1970s forward, certainly since the Reagan Revolution of 1980. I told my class this morning, I recounted the story of 1980 here in Dallas just down the street from here, Ed McAteer had the religious roundtable gathering.
Yes.
Ronald
Yes.
Reagan, the candidate, speaks to these Southern Baptist pastors and others that Ed had organized there. Longtime member of Adrian Rogers Church in Memphis,
Bellevue.
Bellevue.
Bellevue. And Reagan says famously, I know you can't endorse me,
Yes.
but I endorse you.
Yes.
And this is just a few years after Jerry Falwell has launched the moral majority. And all of this is coming into play. And we are bearing the fruit of that in both spheres today. You got to read them side by side.
Jimmy Carter
Yeah,
is the answer that Southern Baptists rejected.
Yes.
Good point.
Stone, the builders rejected, has become the corner.
Mhm.
Indeed. With that, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Great to be with you. Appreciation to all of our panelists. Good night, everyone.
Good to see you all.
Good
Thank
night.
you now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mark, for putting this together, man.